From the Amplified Growth Studios in Alexandria, Virginia, this is Association Chat with your host, KiKi L'Italien. All right. So welcome everybody to Association Chat. This is your place for your weekly discussion on everything that might be topical to the association community. We are here to warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. I'm the host of Association Chat, KiKi L'Italien, and I want to give a couple of shout outs before we get started, before I introduce you to our esteemed guest. So first, as always, I want to give a big thanks to our wonderful sponsor, Fontiva, the AMS for Innovation, for their ongoing support of Association Chat and the community here. Check out fontiva.com to find out more about Fontiva for associations, Fontiva for events, Fontiva for government, and more. Check them out, guys. You can also click on the call to action button, the green button in Crowdcast. They're at fontiva.com. And hey, have you got an extra $25 million lying around in the petty cash drawer that you could afford to lose? No? I didn't think so. If GDPR is stressing you out, I have got some news for you. You can meet with the experts from the Trust Bridge in just 6 days, guys. 6 days when they're in Washington, D.C. They're going to be here from February 26th through March 1st when they hold some one-on-one consultations and workshops. And they're speaking at several events. They're offering a 10% discount to Association Chat members. And so if you're not a member, you need to become one. It's really super easy. Right now, you just join the Facebook private group and look for Association Chat, and you can belong, but you have to belong, guys. And then you can get that 10% discount. So if you aren't a member, why not? Go join the private Facebook group today. All right. So with that said, are we ready for the show, guys? Today, we're talking about a topic that applies to all of us, and that is the danger of generational orthodoxy. Did I say that right? Yes, generational orthodoxy. Whether you work in an environment with boomers, millennials, Gen Xers, or Gen Zers, chances are good that you've heard something about the challenges of communicating with a generation other than your own. But are these categorizations more of a hindrance than a help? Good question. Here to talk with us today is special guest Jeff Cagna, the Association Contrarian and powerhouse behind Foresight First. Welcome, Jeff.
Good afternoon, KiKi. It's good to be back on Association Chat.
Yes, of course. I'm so happy you're here. So, okay. Generational orthodoxy, orthodoxy in general. Let's talk about that. You talk about orthodox beliefs a lot, and I want to make sure everyone watching understands the reasons why, and also, why I'm calling you an association contrarian anyway. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I suppose those two things are connected to each other, and I know there are some people who are probably fed up with me talking about orthodoxy because I do talk about it quite a bit. But there are reasons for that, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about that generally before we dive into some of the more specific issues around generational orthodoxy. So I think the first thing is, I have been arguing for a long time, and I think, I'm not alone in arguing this. But I think more and more people are seeing this today, that we're seeing a rapid acceleration of the transformation of our society, right? Things are getting faster, right? We're seeing more things happening more quickly. The gap between big developments that affect our society is closing each time we have some new development. And so that transformation is something that we've got to prepare our organizations for as quickly as possible. We have to ramp up our pace in order to have a chance of keeping pace with what's happening around us. And orthodox beliefs, these deep-seated assumptions that we make about how the world works, are a drag on our ability to do that. They slow us down, right? And so the more that we devote our attention to thinking about things that are no longer true and helpful, the harder it's going to be for us to prepare for the future. Similarly, along those same lines, so much of what we have to do to prepare is about learning new things, but it's also about unlearning things that don't really help us. And orthodoxy is among those things. And so that's holding us back if we're giving ourselves over to the orthodox beliefs. And the other thing that I would say is that specifically from a perspective of foresight, which is obviously very important to me and I think very important to our organizations, the learning that we have to do, especially at the board level, around the future, the process that we have to go through of sense making, meaning making, and decision making, that cycle of activity that we have to pursue. We're trying to make sense of issues. We're trying to make meaning around them, the human implications, and then make good decisions. Orthodox beliefs are detrimental to us in every phase of that cycle, right? Every step along the way. When orthodoxy gets in there, we are actually limiting our ability to make sense of the world, to make meaning around the world that's unfolding before our eyes, and then to make good decisions. So, not all orthodox beliefs are bad by default. We have to recognize the difference, but every orthodox belief has to be examined in light of what's going on all around us. So that's why this is such an important issue for decision makers in all organizations, and certainly, I suppose I would say it's a particularly important issue for decision makers in legacy organizations. And I don't mean that critically. I think we're talking about organizations with lots of history and tradition in associations. Those organizations have an unusually high amount of orthodox beliefs driving what's going on because they've been around for so long, and the very nature of the organization sort of moves them in that direction almost naturally. So there are a lot of reasons why this is a very important issue for association decision makers to grapple with.
Well, and so why generational? Why are we talking about that today? Because certainly there are so many different areas where we can jump in and start challenging some of those long-held beliefs.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, and I, in my work, I'm trying to address the issue of orthodoxy across a variety of issues that we're grappling with. But I think that we have one of the areas of focus we want to address is this generational orthodoxy challenge, I would say, because the process of building relationships with the stakeholders of the future, which is kind of where I think we have to say our under 40 stakeholders, they're the stakeholders of the future. Some of them are already in our organization, some of them already are connected, but many of them are not. And many of them are still on their way. And so as the stakeholders of the future, we have to treat the idea of building relationships with them as a foresight issue. So for me, this focus on generational orthodoxy is very important because it is so important to the work of foresight. The other aspect of this is, or another aspect is, I think that the relationships we're trying to build with our future stakeholders are going to be built and maintained not by focusing on the past and the present, but really by thinking about the future. Traditionally, associations have tried to build their relationships with stakeholders on the basis of the past and present, right? The history and tradition that I referenced before, right? So we've been around for a long time. We are, we're the premier organization. We're there at the beginning of this field, this industry, this profession. And so we're here for you now. And that's been a very sort of common way that we've talked about membership. But whether or not associations are going to have meaningful relationships with their future stakeholders, their under 40 cohorts, is really going to be grounded more in understanding what those stakeholders face in the years ahead. And particularly over this next decade and even beyond that. And so, in this context, when you're talking about this issue of how do we build long-term, or have the possibility of building long-term relationships with these stakeholders, it has to be concentrating on, what do they face, right? What are they grappling with? And not so much on, well, we've been here for 100 years. And so therefore, and we're going to be here for another 100 more. That's not going to resonate, I think, as a way for us to really be shaping relationships. So the orthodox beliefs then become very dangerous in that context if we assume that our traditional ways of doing business are going to be sustainable.
Yeah. There are so many challenges. And when I start to think about a lot of the assumptions and generalizations that are made about different generations, it's hard for me not to think about the fact that we sort of jumped from boomers to talking about millennials, and that a lot of Gen Xers who are in these positions of, a lot of them are in, high authority positions right now. And we didn't talk a lot about Gen X, except for the fact that they were sandwiched in between, two larger generations. These conversations are interesting to me because it does feel like it's missing big, huge pieces of context that play into any conversation that you're going to have when you're talking about groups of people working together in different demographics, different ages. And so let's talk about some of the dangers. What are some of the dangers of generational orthodoxy? What dangers do you see?
Well, I think, but even before we get to that, I mean, I agree with what you just said, and even before we get to some of the specific, dangers, I think we have to look at the, how we kind of got to this point, right?
So how did we get there? Yeah, how did we get to where we are now? Tell me all about it.
Well, I mean, I can only sort of look at it from my my perspective, and so I've been around associations for more than 25 years, and we've been having this conversation about generations for quite a long time, and I've been in a lot of conversations myself where it's come up. Lots of different venues where we've talked about different aspects, and you're right, sort of looking at, we're talking about millennials, we're talking about Gen Y, we're talking about Gen X, we're talking about boomers, and different iterations of that sort of thing. I think that part of the problem has been that, at the beginning, there wasn't as much discussion around this in associations. As I can recall, there was a time when we didn't talk about it as much. And then it kind of got traction. I think the reason why it got traction is because a lot of people in associations saw this as a way to crack the code on how to attract these younger cohorts to join their organizations. Like we started out with a lot of assumption making about these generations. Gen X are not joiners, and Gen Y or millennials are not joiners. And so then people started diving into this generational conversation to try to crack the code on what would make people join their organizations. And then all of a sudden it kind of blew up, it felt like to me. Like the conversation around generations was everywhere. And perhaps that was driven a little bit by social media, right? So when social media came about, there was definitely a divide that people perceived between younger people who were using social media and older people who weren't using social media. Then we had to kind of disabuse people of that notion that there was a lot of use of social media across these so-called generational categories. And now everywhere you turn, there's a lot of conversation inside and outside of the association world that frames things up in generational terms, but does so, in my opinion, in fairly sloppy ways sometimes. And I'm not indicting all of the work that's been done on generations in that way, but when you look at generational reports, and I have looked at more than a few recently, and some reports peg the time frame of generations. Some generations are 18 years, some generations are 20 years, some generations are 12 years, and it seems to me that they are applying the time frames according to whatever point it is they're trying to make, right? So it's not consistent application. It can be sloppy application. It can lead to very broad generalizations, like Gen X aren't joiners.
Yes.
Or, how many times have you heard someone say, oh, the baby boomers are only interested in themselves? And then
Yes.
heard
All
someone
the
say,
time.
Gen X are only interested in themselves, and millennials are only interested in themselves. So we have these broad generalizations that seem to apply across different generations without distinction. And I think the meaning of some of these labels, categories, has been deeply diluted, and and I think that's really, there's a lot of problems that creates.
I mean, how do you guys feel? And I'm going to just send this out across the socials right now, in Crowdcast for sure. How do you feel about that? What are some of the things that you're hearing? If you think about some of the generalizations that you've heard, have you been hearing some of these things about different generations? Do they apply? What are the things that bother you the most about them? So, what is particularly dangerous about these generalizations being made?
Well, let me tell you a quick story,
Okay.
and hopefully it'll sort of drive that home. So, and I'm going to just try to. It can be a very long story. I'm going to try to keep it, just to the salient details. So, a few years ago, I spoke for a group um, um, in Chicago. They brought in their chapter leaders from around the country for a meeting, and I was asked to speak, and I gave them my talk about, I think, business models or something like that. And as part of that conversation, I always talk about um, the importance of not assuming that every stakeholder is interested in a membership relationship with the organization, right? That we can't continue to rely upon membership-centric business models. And so I did my talk, I finished up, and the next person who came into the session to speak was a member of their staff and someone who was in the membership area. And she was talking to the group about how they were very excited about the fact that they had this platform that allowed them to test different kinds of invoices with different messages
Hmm.
to people who were renewing. So the renewal invoices could be different depending on who they were talking about. And so she was talking about one particular test, right? So she had said that they had done a random sample of their renewal group
Mm-hmm.
and had put a message on the invoice that basically said, I don't remember the exact words, but the gist of it was, it's your obligation to be a member of this association. That
Oh,
was the
oh,
gist of the message, right?
oh
So remember,
God.
they're promoting to a random sample
Oh.
the idea that their responsibility, their obligation, was to join the association. And so they sent that out on the invoice, and she said that had actually negatively correlated to renewal, right? That
Mm-hmm.
people didn't
Yeah.
really like the fact that they were being told more or less that they had an obligation to join. And so someone in the audience, as soon as she finished talking about it, someone in the audience held up his hand and he said, well, that's just a generational thing, isn't it? And the person from the staff said yes. And here's the problem. A few seconds ago, you heard me say they sent it to a random sample,
Right. How would
right?
they know?
They have no way of knowing who the people were. I mean, I suppose they could know who they were, but there's no way that random sample was composed of one generational group. So the
Hmm.
danger is evident in that story, that this idea that people's decisions about things are rooted primarily in their generational identification is a deeply held Orthodox belief, I think.
Mm-hmm.
In associations, it leads us to draw conclusions like Gen X aren't joiners, right? Or this
Mm-hmm.
generation is only interested in itself, or this generation believes in instant gratification. We operate sometimes with that assumption deeply embedded in our thinking, and we don't even realize it. And then a story like that one comes along where we now have to examine, well, wait a minute, we thought this was a generational thing, but it clearly wasn't. There was no way that it could be.
Hmm.
And so we've got to be able to examine that and say, you know what, this is a problem.
Oh, gosh. Okay, so what this is bringing up for me is all kinds of questions, but I do want to bring up a few things that are interesting that are happening over in the chat box right now on Crowdcast. And that is that Joan says some of the information is based on research, and it's difficult to discern why some research is useful and some isn't. Good point. Karen says, I wrote an article recently about having difficult conversations as a boss. Someone replied saying, none of that applies to millennials who can't take criticism at all and need their mothers for everything. I, as a millennial, was astounded. Oh my gosh, I cannot even imagine. Jessica says, I usually only hear the negative of each generation, which shuts people off who fit within those generational groups and isn't helpful to anyone. And Megan says, yes, Jessica, it's why I haven't attended a How to Deal with Millennials session in a long while. And, you know, I have to say, you guys, it seems like every single meeting, conference I go to has something focused on the millennials, right? And then what do you have? You have like the hip, spiky haired guy that's like, and nothing against the people who are speaking about it. I don't mean to be mean about that, but because that was very snarky. I'm sorry. But it's strange because I feel like empathy, right? Empathy maybe is the answer. Maybe we should probably like pull back from a lot of the, hey, old people, get hip with what what the younger generation wants and needs. And maybe all of us need to maybe embrace a little bit of empathy more, or critical thinking even about the way we approach the research that comes out. So let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, how can we maybe challenge some of these dangerous assumptions, and I think maybe misrepresentations of what the different generations are, and what that means for us in the workplace?
So, is it okay, Kiki, before we do that, if I can, I just want to react to some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat
Please, no, react.
discussion. Yeah.
Yes.
So, because I think some good points are being made. So, first of all, with regard to Joan's point, I couldn't agree more. There's so much more generational research that's being done, sort of generationally framed research that's being done. And Joan is absolutely correct. It's difficult sometimes to discern why some of that research, not only is it why it's useful, why is it being done, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that caught my attention recently on LinkedIn, I couldn't find it. I really wanted to find it again, knowing that I was coming on Association Chat today, was an article that I think appeared last week on LinkedIn that was titled "The Brewing Generational War." And the basic gist of the article, I didn't read the whole thing, but as I recall, the basic gist of the article was how, with everything happening with automation and the shifts in our society, and the burdens of fewer workers relative to the growing growing older population, that it's setting up a generational war between the older population of boomers and the younger population of millennials. And this thing, the last time I recall looking at it, had over 25,000 views on LinkedIn. And there were a couple things about it that trouble me. One is, well, I guess it's really one really big thing, which is, why do people insist upon framing up the conversation and how generations, as they define them, need to interact with each other, as it has to be a conflict, right? There must be a conflict by definition between an older generation and a younger generation. That's the only way that they can relate to each other, is we have to put, especially using terms of war, like the brewing generational war. I find it to be very counterproductive. I'm not naive, right? I'm not saying that there aren't issues that we have to address. But this idea that it's okay to frame up the way that our generations interact with each other or at least suggest the idea is that they have to go to war with each other to grapple for who has the power and who has the resources and who's going to be treated well and who's going to be treated poorly. strikes me as particularly counterproductive, and particularly for associations if they buy into that view of things. This idea that there has to be a war, conflict between younger and older, I think is especially unhelpful to us as we try to think about our own futures. So I think that's something that really troubles me. I'll just say one other thing about what's in the chat that I see, which is, I couldn't agree more with those who are saying, going to sessions at conferences that are, about how do you deal with millennials or how do you think about generations. I have not gone to a generationally framed keynote for a very long time. I can't remember the last one I went to. And I don't usually go to those sort of workplace sessions at conferences because I don't have any employees. But most things that happen at conferences that are sort of oriented toward generational issues they're less helpful than they could be, because those sessions often are more concerned about having a compelling soundbite or a tweet away, something that's tweetable, than they are about actually dealing with the substantive issues in kind of a more meaningful way. Now, again, I don't want to criticize all sessions.
Right.
In my experience, that's what you get in those kinds of sessions. It's not stuff that deals substantively as much with the issues. It deals with, what are the big headlines,
right,
and the big tweets, and those things are often orthodox beliefs.
Well, and what you're saying, substantive, that's the thing that I think is lacking in so many of these conversations, is that it's not that I don't want to seem dismissive of research that is valid, that's done, that talks about, maybe people who have been born during a different time have different expectations and they want different things from whether it's a meeting or a membership or what have you. Those are interesting discussions to have. I think they're important discussions to have. What I don't like is a lot of the overgeneralization where it is an us versus them thing. And it's not taking a deeper look at some of the things that are being brought up in the chat box right now, which is, well, sure, there's going to be conflict when somebody who's higher paid and older is being pushed out so that someone younger gets underpaid for the same job. Of course, there's going to be conflict.
Sure, of course.
There's a lot that is there for all of us to sort of break down and look at. But certainly it can be said that this is a more complex issue than a lot of people present it. I look at it as a marketing thing most of the time. Most of the time when I see something that has different generations working together, it comes across more as a marketing piece than it does as research or as something that can be actually applied in a meaningful way. But maybe I'm cynical on that. Maybe I'm looking at it from a pessimistic sort of viewpoint.
I don't think so, KiKi. I agree with you. And just to go back to Jones, she has a follow-up question about defining generationally framed. What I mean is research that is basically an attempt to understand generations according to some time frame that they produce. And again, sometimes those time frames are organized according to the way that the company doing the research wants them to be. So the one thing I notice quite a bit is how compressed so-called Generation X becomes in a lot of these research efforts. Right, that the boomers are fairly stably defined as being between certain years, but the creep of the years being used to define millennials seems to grow, and so now all of a sudden a generation that according to Strauss and Howe, which I use as sort of the benchmark, if you're going to look at things generationally, the benchmark for me is the work of Strauss and Howe. 1961 to 1981 is what they would regard as Generation X. So now that's a 20-year time frame. Everything or many things that I see that do research that look at Generation X push that down from 20 years to 15 to 12 to 11, right? So now all of a sudden, people who were born in Generation X are only born between the years 1964 and 1975. Well, that's just not true, right?
Yeah.
And so, setting aside for the moment, the issue around those years, the idea that there is this willingness to shape research according to timeframes that work for your particular purpose is problematic, right? Because now we're not getting a real understanding of what's going on, and that's not helpful for anybody. And I would agree with you that a lot of this is done in service of marketing ends, that by companies in particular that are trying to sell products and services that are designed to address some, in their minds, address some generational issue that their customers are facing.
I mean, I'll tell you, I've read a lot of this stuff, a lot of this research where it's telling me that if you're a millennial, you care more about social causes, but you also care more about fashion. You're more into food. You're like, and it has like all of these different interest areas that if you're going to market to a millennial, that these are the areas that you really need to target. I'm not saying that doesn't have some sort of, maybe it's accurate. I don't know. But I think that something happened along the way where maybe we got a little too aggressive with applying this to try to make it fit everything, right? Every
Right.
situation, every conversation. And what I was interested in when we were approaching this conversation today was in looking at how that can actually hurt some of our relationships or some of the things that we're trying to accomplish in organizations, when I think people are coming most of the time from a good place. They're trying to accomplish good things. But I think and that's Pollyanna-ish maybe, but I think that we get in our own way when we maybe subscribe to one way of looking at something and saying, okay, everything's generations, and I'm just not going to let me talk to this millennial in, using food pictures or something. It's not going to be the answer.
Yeah, since this idea that we can apply simple categories, as Michael's saying here, based upon people's birth dates, and walk away with an understanding of a complex person is not true. It's simply not true.
Yeah.
And there's research that can be useful to understand what people care about, and that sort of. But really, it's about how people make sense of the world and how they have developed as people. So, for example, like recently, as I'm preparing for my own briefing on the under 40 future, next month, I've been doing a lot of research looking at things and trying to understand things. And I found an article last month on the BBC website that talks about how researchers there was an article published in a medical journal in the UK, are suggesting that we should extend the period of adolescence from 10 to 24 years of age, as opposed to 10 to 19, right? Now, some people would say, okay, well, that might be, and in fact, they say this in the article, that might be infantilizing kids further, young people further, because part of what they argue is, people are delaying things, they're spending more time at home and that kind of thing. But part of it is also about physical and emotional maturity. My point is that I don't know that I agree or disagree with what the article is arguing, that we should go from 10 to 24 versus 10 to 19. It's that the generational boundaries don't coincide neatly with our more complex understanding of people, right? And so as things like that emerge, we have to be flexible enough in our mindset to say, you know what, we're not just going to try to address people based upon what cohort we've put them in, based upon their birth year. We have to understand them in the context of who they are as people and what they are trying to address in their lives, how they're making sense of it, and then also how they are developing as human beings. This could not be more critical, by the way, in a world in which we are having an active conversation about how technology could well supplant many aspects of what human beings do right now in work, and will certainly affect, at a minimum, even if we don't have, major shifts away from human work, which I don't necessarily believe will occur anyway. But even if that doesn't happen, all of us are going to interact more with machines. And so the very definition of what it means to be human is shifting before our eyes. And this idea that we can apply these very generic, very flexible, often, commercially motivated kinds of labels and use that as a lens through which to understand people, I think presents problems.
Mm-hmm. Oh gosh. You guys, sometimes there are discussions that we have on the chat that there's so many different directions that I could go. And I feel like I wish that all of us could be sitting in a room, right? And that I could be reading your faces and figuring out which direction you want to go. But what this makes me think of, Jeff, is that as we're talking about machine learning and talking about the ways that we interact with machines, yeah, lately I've been reading a lot about design thinking, and I know that you were the first person I ever talked with very much about design thinking way back when, talking about like Marty Neumeier and all of that. And I totally credit you with jumping into reading more about that years ago because you pointed me in that direction. But one of the first things you're supposed to do is look at your audience, look at your participants, look at your employees, look at your customers, and empathize, meaning getting into truly understanding who it is that you're working with and talking with. And especially it feels like in this climate today, that piece is so often missing. And so, I wanted to bring in, and I'm just going to let you think about that a little bit and then maybe respond back. But I want to bring in some of the comments I'm seeing over here. Karen says, I think birth dates do matter. The post 9/11 generation has a totally different experience, but we tend towards oversimplification of groups based upon relatively arbitrary boundaries. Michael says, any data point can be dangerous if misused. We need to be more broadly considerate of multiple aspects of the human character. It is not dismissing age, it is putting it in context. Oh, so well said. And Howard, if we were sitting in a room, we'd all be making unconscious judgments based on what generation we perceive the other person to be, among other things. And that's true too. We have this tendency towards bias, and we have to be aware that we have those things that take place. And I think always challenging our assumptions, that's a challenge each one of us independently need to make. But, Jeff, on the subject of empathy, when you are working with different leadership groups and going in, how does that play into this conversation? I mean, I know foresight is the big focus, but what role does empathy play in maybe navigating communication with different generations and also approaching this topic, generational orthodoxy?
So, sorry, I always do this to you, but just before I answer that, I just want to react to something from Karen. I'm because her comment is, I think, a good one. I think all the comments have been great as well, but I just wanted, there was something that popped into my head around that, which is, I would agree, that birth dates do matter, but let's talk about it because she specifically references post 9/11. Well, my thing would be, is it really all post 9/11, or is it like, who really is experiencing it? Is it the kids who were old enough on 9/11 to understand what the world was like before and what the world is like after? Or is it the kids who were born after 9/11 who just simply live in a world that is different, but they never knew what the world was before that? So all I'm saying is that, yes, those dates matter, the events that shape our experiences, do matter. There's no question about that, but it's not the totality
But how do we define that? Yeah.
of how it shapes things. So to your question about empathy, I think probably that, like I'm concerned that this conversation, might leave some people with the impression that, I'm sort of down on all these people who are doing generational research, and that's not
Yeah.
really the case. I think a lot of this generational research is probably done. Some of it is done with a purely commercial motive in mind, and there's no question about that because that's the way the world works. For better or for worse, we can debate that in another association chat in the future. But I think for some researchers, right, some people who are writing books or speaking or doing things, it is about an attempt to bring more empathy to the table, right? That's what it is about. And for me, I don't think you can really pursue the work of Foresight without the willingness to be empathic in your approach, right? You have to be empathic in your approach. And for me, the whole cycle of learning that I encourage boards to pursue, that any one of us really can pursue, but I concentrate, of course, because of my work on the duty of Foresight, I concentrate on boards, and that's where I put most of my attention. Um, you know, Part of that cycle is meaning making, right? So it's sense making, meaning making, decision making. Sense making is about understanding something on an intellectual basis and gathering up information and trying to make sense of it so that you know what you're talking about, right? And then meaning making is about appreciating the human implications of whatever that thing is. And that requires empathy, right? We can't actually have a conversation around the meaning of something like artificial intelligence. I brought it before. We can't really have a conversation about what that means to our stakeholders if we are not empathic in our understanding of what the implications of artificial intelligence are. And so once again, that's where, the orthodoxy of generations can actually get in the way of being truly empathic, because if we default to our assumption that millennials or boomers or Xers or whatever sort of little micro groups have popped up in recent years,
I'm gonna make
Zennials
my
and
own group.
iGens,
I'm gonna make my own
um,
group.
if we default to the assumptions, then we might perceive ourselves to be empathic, but we aren't actually empathic because we're just operating on a generic belief rather than saying, you know what, we've got to have a much more human understanding of this that is not driven by someone's external assumption about what this is about.
Yeah. Gosh, Joan says context. It's entirely context, and we don't do it. I love the early days of social media before it was called that. AOL chat rooms, when we didn't know names, ages, even gender or gender ID. It flowed better because we didn't have biases based on more than conversation, and we were forgiving about grammar, even in a writer's room. Adrian says, and hey guys, hey Adrian, relevant quote, technology is anything that was invented after you were born, by Alan Kay. And Karen says, for what it's worth, the journalism world where I work is also struggling with the importance of context in a 280 character world. Jessica says, yes, I'm a millennial who still carries around a physical planner. Oh my gosh, yes. My grandmother got on to me saying that my phone could do that. I know people come back to me and they tell me at meetings, they say, haha, I'm tweeting more than the digital strategist. But the fact is that, well, that's not how I get the most out of my meetings, right? I like to draw and write things down with a pen that has really great ink flow. And that's just what I really get into. And so to each his own. But I do think this is an interesting thing that so many of us, we have all of these differences and similarities. And I too remember the day when you didn't necessarily know who you were talking to in a listserv or in a chat room. And it was good, right? It was a good thing because in my case, all I knew is that we all liked Depeche Mode as a band. And we went from there. Karen says, studies show that, that writing is better for retention than typing. Yes, I know. And, I think it's also, for me, stress relief. So there you have it. But, as we're looking at as leaders, working with leaders, going into workplaces, and we're reflecting on the conversation today. How can we take this and move forward with it? Because we know that we're glossing over a lot when we subscribe to, if we automatically look over and say, well, you millennial and you Gen Xer, you're a do-it-yourselfer, whatever. We are both cutting that person short. We're dismissing that person somewhat. We're probably not paying as close attention to the dynamic or the engagement that we have with that relationship. And so it's dangerous in all ways.
It is, and I want to go back to something Howard, a comment he made earlier about, when you said, you wish we could all be sitting in a room talking about this, and he said if we were sitting in a room, we'd all be making unconscious judgments based on what generation we perceive others to be, among other things, and he's absolutely right, and that's a concept from organizational learning known as the ladder of inference, right, which is something very small that someone can do, or so that someone presents can lead us to make a whole bunch of inferences about what it is they're actually thinking on something. And we could be sitting in a room having a conversation, and someone could look at me in a strange way, and I will perceive their look to be one thing. I'll make an inference about what their look means, and as a result of that inference, I'll make a whole other series of additional inferences that get me to a place that says, oh, that person's really upset with me, or they don't like me because of this or that, even though I've got very little to base on except my initial inference, right? And we make those inferences based on generational issues as well, as you just suggested, that someone is young, therefore they must be inexperienced, and therefore if they're inexperienced, they don't know what they're talking about, so I'm free to ignore them when they say something, in a meeting. And again, if the intention, here is to build lasting relationships, or at least have the potential for lasting relationships with these stakeholders under 40, right? Then we've got to at least be able to take a step back and say, okay, what am I getting from generational research, or research that purports to be about building generational understanding? And what can I use from that would at least help me frame the conversation in a more beneficial way? Not make assumptions and not draw inferences, but frame up a conversation that can be more beneficial and take us toward the outcome that we want, which is trying to build these stronger relationships that are more future focused. I can't emphasize enough, actually, how important it is for us to look at this discussion around building relationships with under 40 stakeholders in a future context rather than a past context. That it's not about our great annual meeting that we've been doing for 100 years, or our tremendous, publication that's been around for 75 years. That's not going to be the basis for the relationships we have with under 40 stakeholders. Our basis is going to be, how are you going to help me as someone who's in her 20s or his early 30s figure out what my role is in a field, in a profession or industry that could well be overtaken to some extent by automation, by artificial intelligence, by other factors that could really reshape the way work gets done. How will you help me figure out how I need to educate myself, how I need to prepare myself for that world? It's not about, you've had this wonderful 100-year history, and so therefore I'm going to, send you my money. That's not going to work. And so we've really got to reshape our approach to reflect that understanding of them being, of that group, of those cohorts being situated in a different place than their predecessors.
Yeah, I like that. It's not, in other words, it's not easy. It's not so easy to just say, well, all millennials are this according to research, so we're going to change our registration form and we're going to change our join form, and somehow we're going to be able to apply this, and automatically we're just going to have those members and that will solve all of our problems. It might have to involve building actual relationships, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be focused. I mean, again, we've talked about empathy throughout this conversation today, and I think what is missing, quite honestly, in a lot of association discussions at the board level, is any sense of, or I shouldn't say any sense. There is a limited sense of empathy for the real world challenges that the stakeholders of the future are facing. Like, I think a lot of directors, in my experience, people who are closer to my age, people who are, I'm going to be 50 next month, so people who are 50 years of age and older, I think sometimes struggle with the idea that being a 25-year-old person in a given field, in 2018 is very different than being a 25-year-old person in 1993.
Yeah.
Right. And even before that, right? That if you're a 65 or a year old or older director, your understanding of what it means to be 25 in your field is in 2018. Like, if I were to say to those directors that I think it's important for our organizations to bring in this under 40 cohort into the strategy making process in a very, very specific way, where they really have a lot more influence over what happens, sometimes those people would say, what qualifies that group to formulate strategy for the association? And my response to them would be impolite, because it's a question, answering a question with a question. But my response would be to them, what qualifies you to understand the world of that 25-year-old person?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the answer is very little. Very little qualifies that older director to have that understanding. And I'm not making a generalization here. There are probably some directors who have a great insight into things. My point is that there's nothing really in their background that helps them fully appreciate what's going on for that 25-year-old person today. So for me, the empathy has to be driving our process far more than it is right now.
So Joan says, laughing, have known you so long, but thinking of you at 50 is, well, remarkable. It's funny when because as time goes on, those of us who were the young professionals, remember back in the day, look at it, and the conversations change and they stay the same. There's something that one of the things that Seth Godin says in it's a little dated now, this reference, but in Purple Cow, he says, one of the main tenets that you're supposed to know is that safe is risky. And I feel like that is important to note here, because if you think that you can sit down and keep your little handy chart of DISC assessments or Myers-Briggs or generational or astrological or Enneagram or whatever, and you can just assign that and cross-reference it to the people sitting around you at the table. Look, trying to understand people is always a good idea. You want to read up about the people of Puerto Rico before you go and visit Puerto Rico, fantastic. But don't assume that they all like the same things. Don't assume that they all eat at the same place. Don't assume that they have the same background, right? And it's the same with generations or astrological signs, or if you're an INTJ, I'm the weirdest INTJ Sagittarius you'll ever meet. So I don't really fit into all of those boxes so neatly. So I think that what we're hearing here today is that, yes, it can help you to understand a little bit more about different people who might be sitting at the table, but do not take that so far. Don't take it so far that it gets in the way of actually making real progress and getting to know them at a deeper level. Howard says,
Yeah.
INTJ Aries here. I've learned to live with the weirdness. Yeah.
Hey, me too, Howard. I'm an INTJ Aries as well. So yes, so two things that I wanted to say to that. I would totally agree with you in what you're saying, and the way that I talk about it is, how do we avoid being captive to orthodoxy, right? Which is the way that we often, you too, Howard. That's often the reason, that's often the issue. We're captive to orthodoxy. So it kind of goes back to where we began the conversation when we started, which is, we can't, we have to recognize what's happening all around us, right? And what's happening all around us is things are getting faster, transformation's happening more rapidly. It's getting deeper, more intense, and it's easy in that situation to say, you know what, I'm gonna relax on some of these issues because I'm so busy with so many other things going on, and it's easy to take that step back. But actually, what it means is that we have to be far more intentional in our efforts to avoid being captive because we're being bombarded with so much information. Some of it is good, some of it is of dubious quality. We have to be more, you said it earlier, more critical in our thinking, right? More skeptical of things. And especially in an area like this where we know it has such a huge influence on the way we think about things in associations, right? I mean, there are certain things that really shape the way associations think about their work, and this is one of them, right? This whole generational conversation is one of them. So we have to be more intentional in our approach, and that really also sort of leads to another point, which is I mentioned earlier about the importance of learning and unlearning and relearning.
Mm.
That is now a non-negotiable aspect of the work for boards, for CEOs, for association staff. It's not something no one can sort of step out and say, you know what, well, it's good if we learn. Like, learning is good, right? Of course, learning is good. Learning has always been good. In 2018, and from this point forward, the capacity and the commitment to learning, the intentional learning process, which is the way I'm now talking about it with respect to boards of directors. Boards have a fundamental need to pursue learning intentionally. That is non-negotiable for those groups. We
Mm.
have to recruit. We have to recruit to boards of directors and to CEO positions diverse and insatiably curious people who bring an unswerving commitment to the importance of learning, because it's the only way, it's the only strategy that's going to really enable us to drive our organizations forward on things like this and other issues of orthodoxy that could cripple us otherwise.
Okay, so I pretty much need to make that a soundbite that just plays over and over again for people because I love this intentional learning process that we need diverse and insatiably curious people who are dedicated to learning. Yes, safe is risky. And what you need to do is you need to be able to learn and adapt and grow. Deborah, I don't want to leave you out. You say another trend, people are living and working longer. We have some members who are over 100 years old. And Howard says, what's interesting to me is when it comes from both directions, when leadership, especially in my world, yes, boomers and even older, especially on boards, tell management that we're not communicating the right way with the younger generation. And then the younger members tell us that we offer nothing relevant for them. So you just can't win, Oh, and I
And
totally,
Howard,
oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, and Howard put his finger on another one of the orthodoxies, that it's all about communication. How do we
Yeah.
talk about it with younger cohorts? And the answer is it's always about how you talk about it with people. But the assumption is that if we just frame up our traditional ways of doing things, dress it up with more contemporary language, or put a Twitter icon on it,
Mhm.
that all of a sudden answers the problem, and that's not real. That's not the issue.
Oh no, it doesn't solve it. It doesn't. You're not covering all your bases by showing that you're digitally savvy. Oh man. And Megan says communication. Yes, it's all about that. Well, guys, I can't believe it. We're toward the end of the hour. And Jeff, I made a post. Anybody who's listening to this right now, who is watching on Twitter or watching on Facebook, in order to be eligible for some great prizes from Jeff, including 2 complimentary subscriptions to the full Foresight First 2018 briefing series, you need to register here. So this is kind of your now 1 minute call, your 1 minute warning that if you want to register here, you can. And here meaning Crowdcast, so that he has a way to contact you. But I want to thank you so much, Joan. Thank you, Megan, Howard, Deborah, Jeff. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for being a part of this great conversation today and being my guest on Association Chat.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate it, Kiki. And there's more information on the Foresight First Facebook page about both the series, the Foresight First briefing series, and also the Under 40 Future briefing, which is coming up on March 29th. So at the end of next month at 2 p.m. I hope if people are interested, they'll check it out.
Right. And I want to let everyone know. So, Jeff, this is just kicking off the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have throughout the year, throughout 2018. We're trying to have a conversation each quarter. So, and they're all different. They're all going to be a little bit different. And so I want you to make sure that you keep an eye out for upcoming chats where Jeff will come on and we'll have another in-depth discussion about another topic. So thank you for being my guest. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Association Chat. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like the show, please be sure to join the private Facebook group for Association Chat and come back next week when we talk about how to steal like a fundraiser. And I promise no laws were broken in the writing of this white paper. I'm going to have 2 fantastic guests on talking about that. And until next time, everyone, keep asking questions to learn every day. As Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great week, everybody. Thanks for listening to this episode of Association Chat. If you like this episode or even just the concept of the show, please subscribe and share it with your friends. We'd love to have them here.